A wounded F9F Panther roared through the cold November skies over Korea, its engines straining against heavy damage. Lieutenant Royce Williams fought to keep the aircraft steady, pushing full throttle toward USS Oriskany, which lay ahead, its deck pitched and swaying in the tumultuous sea. Below, the escorting destroyer, unaware of his situation, opened fire. Tracers tore through the air, narrowly missing before the ship's crew realized the sputtering aircraft was one of their own. The winds whipped around Williams as the Panther's controls became sluggish, unresponsive. With the carrier now at general quarters, Williams radioed in. His approach was off by 15 degrees, and his speed was dangerously high, 200 miles per hour, nearly 100 faster than normal. The captain of Oriskany ordered a course change, trying to line up with the Panther's increasingly erratic descent. Still, with the deck shifting beneath his crippled fighter, in the next moments, Lieutenant Williams would either pull off the impossible or join the frozen depths below. An unexpected swarm. USS Oriskany, an Essex-class aircraft carrier, had prowled Korean waters since October 1952, its Air Group 102 launching relentless sorties over enemy terrain. Chongjin, a critical logistics hub funneling supplies from the PRC and Soviet Vladivostok to North Korean forces, was a prime target. Pilots of Air Group 102 roamed northeastern Korea, strafing convoys, smashing trains, and dropping ordnance on strategic bridges to choke supply routes. Among the crew of Oriskany was Lieutenant Royce Williams. A South Dakota native, he had traded his Minnesota National Guard corporal stripes for Navy gold wings in 1945. Now, with Fighter Squadron 781, as part of Air Group 102, he piloted an F9F Panther into the crucible of combat. The Panther was the Navy's first effective carrier-based aircraft. This high-performance jet fighter was armed with 4 20mm cannons. Engineered for precision, it excelled in both air-to-air dogfights and air-to-ground strikes. On November 18, 1952, USS Oriskany was cutting through the frigid waters off North Korea's northeast coast, 50 miles east of Chongjin, and less than 100 miles from Soviet air and naval bases at Vladivostok. The weather was merciless. Heavy snow blanketed Oriskany and the rest of Task Force 77 of the U.S. Navy's 7th Fleet. With air temperatures in the low 20s Fahrenheit and water barely above freezing, anyone who went overboard in these icy depths would be frozen stiff within minutes, lost to hypothermia. The conditions were brutal, but Oriskany maintained routine operations. Then, a top-secret transmission crackled through the comms. Fighter jets were inbound, flying south from Vladivostok, heading directly for Task Force 77. Trouble had been expected by the fleet. The patrol was bracing for North Korean retaliation after a strike near the Russian border. But these weren't North Korean planes. They were Soviet MiG-15s from Vladivostok, and they were suddenly closing in. These Soviet jet fighters were known for high-speed capabilities, swept-wing design, and powerful 37mm and 23mm cannons, making them a formidable opponent in early jet combat. The F9F Panther boasted a sleek design and formidable firepower, but its speed and climb rate fell short against the MiG-15. With a top speed of 600 miles per hour, the Panther lagged nearly 100 miles per hour behind its Soviet rival. The MiG-15's superior climb rate of 10,000 feet per minute further dwarfed the Panther's 4,900 feet per minute, giving it a decisive edge in vertical maneuvering. The atmosphere aboard Oriskany thickened with tension. Navy doctrine was unyielding. Intercept before the enemy could launch weapons. No mistakes, no hesitation. The word spread fast. Aircraft were needed, now. Below deck, the sound of engines roared to life as pilots scrambled. The deck crew moved like lightning, every second a countdown as they prepared the F9F Panthers for an all-out engagement in the freezing, hostile skies. Lieutenant Royce Williams and 3 BF-781 pilots, his own wingman, Lieutenant Dave Rowlands, and Lieutenant Claire Elwood with wingman Lieutenant John Middleton, manned their F9F-5s at 1 p.m., engines growling to life as they prepared for the imminent intercept. The F9F-5s took off and tore through the sky, cutting a path through the blizzard toward their target. Suddenly, Lieutenant Elwood's signal cut through the chaos. fuel and hydraulic failure. The message was grim. He and his wingman had to abort, heading back to the carrier with the enemy still closing in. Williams and Lieutenant John Middleton were now alone, facing the mission without backup. Williams' flight was vectored toward a group of MiGs, detected 80 nautical miles north-northeast of the task force. The two F9F Panthers turned, engines roaring as they sped toward the target. At 12,000 feet, the aircraft broke through the cloud cover, climbing rapidly toward 16,000. Then, 45 miles from the carrier, Williams spotted contrails. MiGs. The enemy aircraft were higher, well above 30,000 feet. Williams pushed his Panther higher, intent on closing the gap. He radioed Oriskany, reporting a tally-ho on the MiGs. 3 jet fighters in one group, 4 in the other. The Soviet fighter group split apart, diving at full speed, closing in from all angles as they zeroed in on the Panthers. Tension spiked as Williams' finger hovered near the trigger, heart pounding in sync with his climb. Then, a crackling voice from the Combat Information Center aboard Oriskany interrupted his focus. Do not engage. Williams hesitated, the enemy bearing down on him, but obeyed. His instincts screamed to fight, but the command was clear. He adjusted course. But right when he was about to fly out of the immediate combat zone, the MiGs opened fire. Their 23 and 37mm cannons erupted with deafening bursts. Tracers screamed past Williams' F9F5, narrowly missing. His pulse quickened. Eyes locked on the targets, he swiftly armed his own cannons, adjusting course to stay on their tail, screaming over the radio, quote, "We are already engaged." There was no hesitation now. Fight or fall. The battle had begun. This would be the first and last time U.S. fighters clashed with Russian MiGs from a Soviet base. A high-stakes battle erased from history's pages for 40 years. Full throttle engagement. Williams would later recall those first fateful shots across the bow, saying, quote, "They came diving at us and were coming in hot. They fired first, so we knew we were in a fight." Both Middleton and Williams fired a short burst at a MiG. Pieces flew off the Soviet fighter, smoke billowing as it dove past. Middleton stayed on the damaged MiG's tail, hoping to finish it, but his hopes shattered as all 4 of his 20mm cannons jammed. Frustrated, he called off the chase. After Middleton's cannon failed, the situation grew dire. With his wingman disabled, Williams made the call. He ordered Middleton to return to Oriskany. Now, Williams was alone in his Panther against the remaining MiGs. Williams quickly assessed the situation. 6 MiG-15s were closing in. The MiGs held an 80-knot advantage in level flight and a far higher climb rate. The Soviet jets rocketed above him, preparing for another diving pass. Williams knew a vertical fight was a losing game. He had no hope of outclimbing them. With pinpoint precision, Williams rolled the F9F into a tight turn, forcing the MiGs to overshoot each time they closed in on his tail. The 6 MiGs swirled around Williams' Panther like vultures, but his hands were steady on the controls. As one MiG crossed in front of him, Williams squeezed the trigger, firing an almost 90-degree deflection shot. The round slammed into the MiG, chunks flying off as the Soviet fighter spiraled out of control. The pilot ejected, his parachute blooming against the sky. Williams didn't have time to watch. His head was on a swivel, scanning for the next threat. The 5 remaining MiGs pressed the attack, converging from all directions. Williams weaved, banked hard, and clawed for every sliver of sky, fully aware the odds were stacked against him. In the midst of a tight, calculated turn, his F9F carved through the icy air, eyes darting to track threats. Out of nowhere, a MiG-15 streaked beneath him, then rocketed upward in a sharp climb, cutting dangerously close in front of his aircraft. Williams reacted instantly, yanking the controls hard to line up the pipper on the enemy. His fingers squeezed the trigger, and his 4 20mm cannons erupted. The MiG exploded, slabs of metal flying off as it spiraled downward, smoke trailing from its shattered fuselage. A few turns later, another MiG-15 dove at him, coming in fast and straight. Williams didn't hesitate. He rolled out of his turn, climbing sharply to meet the threat head-on. The MiG fired first, its longer-range cannons spitting rounds at Williams. The shells screamed past, narrowly missing as he held his climb. Now in range, Williams squeezed the trigger again. His 20mm shells lit up the MiG, the flashes visible from his cockpit as they hit their target. The Soviet fighter jerked violently, smoke billowing from its engines. It immediately started spinning out of control, trailing black smoke as it fell away from the fight. But then, Williams's gun suddenly fell silent. He was out of ammo. The realization hit him like a cold slap, but there was no time to dwell on it. The MiGs were still on his tail, relentless. With the remaining MiGs hot on his heels, Williams dove toward the clouds, aiming to lose them in the cover of the low overcast. The tops of the clouds were at 12,000 feet, his only hope to shake off the pursuit. He pushed the F9F downward, the engines roaring as the enemy's guns opened up behind him. A 37mm shell from one of the MiGs hit the accessory section of the Panther's engine. The explosion rocked the aircraft, severing Williams' rudder cables and knocking out the hydraulics. Suddenly, his control was limited. He could only use his elevator and ailerons with difficulty, making every maneuver more critical. A barrage of 23mm cannon shells ripped through the air. Several shells hit his F9F, puncturing the fuselage as Williams fought to stay alive. Williams slammed the stick, porpoising the F9F, making sharp, erratic pitch movements using the elevator to evade the incoming rounds, his grip tight as he fought to maintain control under heavy fire. Williams punched through the cloud cover, his instruments flickering as he fought for control. The rudder and flaps were unresponsive, leaving him with only partial aileron control, which he had to operate manually. The MiGs had been lost in the clouds, but so had his clear vision of the world outside his aircraft's window. He broke through the clouds again, now dangerously low at just 400 feet. Fuel was running low, and his troubles weren't over. Below 170 knots, the F9F became uncontrollable. At that speed, a safe landing was impossible. Normal landing speed was around 120 knots, but with his jet barely flyable, any attempt would be a gamble. Bailing out wasn't an option either. Ejecting into the freezing water below, just 37 degrees Fahrenheit, meant certain fatal hypothermia. Williams would one day explain, quote, "Normally I would have ejected, but with the cold water conditions I wouldn't have lasted long. So I stuck with it and headed back to the task force." A perilous touchdown. Williams' F9F was barely flying, its controls sluggish and unreliable. Still, he fought to keep the crippled F9F steady, pushing full throttle toward Oriskany. The carrier was at general quarters, but the escorting destroyer had no word of Williams' distress. Gun crews, unaware of the danger, saw his crippled plane as it bore down toward them. Without hesitation, they opened fire. Tracers cut through the sky, slamming past his damaged fighter, missing by mere inches. Each burst threatened to send him spiraling, but Williams fought to maintain control. Finally, another Navy pilot radioed in, identifying Williams' aircraft as friendly. But the danger wasn't over. With his plane barely holding together, Williams still had to make the treacherous landing. Aboard Oriskany, the captain, now fully aware of the dire situation, turned the carrier to align with Williams' descent for a straight-in approach. The ship's deck seemed impossibly far away as he fought the wrecked Panther toward the carrier. Williams' grip tightened on the controls, his mind focused, hands unsteady but determined. Williams later recalled, quote, "I told the carrier I'm going to be landing at about 200 miles per hour, about 95 miles an hour faster than normal. I'm also having control problems and can't line up with the ship. I'm off by about 15 degrees. We also had heavy winds and a pitching deck." It was going to be something. The ship's deck, pitching heavily in the waves, loomed closer. The moment of truth fast approaching. The roar of the engines and the rush of wind filled his ears. As he neared, every muscle tensed, fighting the crippled aircraft. His heart pounded as the arrestor hook shot out. Finally, it caught. The 3-wire snapped tight, halting his descent in a violent jolt. He had made it. Williams surveyed the damage to his Panther in disbelief. The flight crew counted 263 holes. most from shrapnel, after a 37mm shell detonated in the engine's accessory section. A silenced victory. After Williams landed, Vice Admiral Robert P. Briscoe gave him strict orders never to speak of what had happened in those skies. The enemy jets were Soviet, and revealing the news could draw Russia into the conflict. Briscoe also mentioned that a National Security Agency team was intercepting Soviet radio messages. Word leaking out could jeopardize other sensitive operations. As a result, Williams' actions remained classified for 40 years. At the age of 97, he recalled finally being able to share the story. Williams earned the Silver Star, but a congressional effort sought a Medal of Honor upgrade. Ultimately, he received the Navy Cross in January 2023.